They hid me in the kitchen during the mating ball, and I told myself it was for everyone's good, mine included. The smoke from the roasting fires had long since worked itself into my hair, into the rough weave of my dress, into the skin of my hands where the calluses had built up over years of hauling, scrubbing, lifting things that no one else would touch. I was not a guest at Blackthorn Keep that night. I was a fixture of it, the way the stone hearth was a fixture, the way the iron hooks for hanging game were fixtures, functional, unremarkable, easy to ignore. Lady Marin had explained it simply enough when she pulled me aside that afternoon, her fingers closing around my wrist with the particular firmness of a woman who expects no argument. Tonight you will stay in the kitchens. Tonight is not a night for you. I had not argued. I never argued. My name was Senna. I was 22 years old, and I had spent every one of those years understanding, in the marrow of my bones, that there were spaces in the world I was not meant to occupy. What I had not told anyone, what I had told no one. Not the scullery women who shared my pallet room, not the old herb keeper Dorson who had been kind to me since childhood, not even myself in any language more honest than the vaguest, most private ache was that I already knew who my mate was. I had known for 3 years. The Alpha King's name was Caelum Drest, and he did not know I existed. I had first caught his scent when he passed through Blackthorn on Progress 3 years ago, in the deep amber weeks of autumn. I had been carrying a crate of dried herbs across the inner courtyard when his riding party swept through the gates, and the wind had shifted, and something inside me had simply stopped. Not my heart, not my breath. Something deeper than either, some root function of what I was, had gone perfectly, terrifyingly still. I had stood with the crate in my arms and stared at the back of a man I could not fully see through the press of riders and banners and dust, and my wolf, who had never once spoken clearly to me in all my years, had said one word with the force of absolute certainty. Him. I had gone back to the kitchens and said nothing, because what was there to say? He was the Alpha King of the 4 northern packs, sovereign of more territory than most wolves would cross in a lifetime. He was the man who had ended the Ashvale War with 3 words and a signed bone treaty, the man whose cold authority had held the northern packs together through the worst drought in living memory. He was 29 years old and had never taken a mate, which the gossip line of every keep and holding in the north treated as a standing wound, a political emergency, a riddle to be solved by the right high-born she-wolf at the right glittering occasion. And I was Senna, no surname, no pack. Taken in as a child by Lady Marin's household when my mother died on the road, raised in the servants' quarters. Classified in the keep's records as a domestic ward, which was the polite way of writing down that no one had ever claimed me, that I existed in the spaces between things, useful and invisible and entirely without standing. So I had gone back to the kitchens, and I had stayed there for 3 years. And every time Caelum Drest's name came up in the conversations that drifted down from the great hall, and it came up often, I had closed the door of myself very carefully and turned back to whatever work was in my hands. Tonight the work was roasting. 3 whole boars on the long spits, turning by rotation of the kitchen boys, filling the vaulted stone space with fat smoke, and the sweet char of rosemary bundles thrown into the fire for fragrance. The great hall above us was already lit with 100 candles, already filling with the she-wolves from every high family in the Northern Territory, every one of them groomed and gowned and hoping. The mating ball was the Alpha King's first public acknowledgement that he would seek a mate that was the political story anyway. The real story, the one everyone whispered, was that the High Council had given him until the winter solstice to bond or face a succession challenge. He was out of time. And so, for one night, Blackthorn Keep had been transformed into something luminous and terrifying, and I was in the basement of it, turning a spit handle in slow circles and listening to the sound of it through the ceiling boards. I could hear the music, a low, rolling thing, string instruments, and a single horn, the kind of music designed to sound effortless while being precisely calculated. I could hear the footsteps, the percussion of heeled boots and the lighter tap of women's slippers crossing stone floors. I could hear the laughter, and there was something in it, something bright and expectant and slightly desperate, that made my chest hurt in a way I had learned not to examine too closely. My wolf was restless. She had been restless since morning, pacing the interior of me in a way she rarely did, pressing against the edges of my awareness with an urgency I could not fully account for. I had told her, silently, the way I always addressed her when she got like this, that there was nothing to be done. She had not found that satisfying. She rarely found anything satisfying, my wolf. She was the most inconvenient part of me, too large for the life I had, too hungry for things that were never going to be available. I had spent years developing a careful, practical relationship with her, the way you develop a careful relationship with a fire you live beside. You respect the heat, you don't let it spread, and you never forget what it could do if you stopped watching. Tonight, she was not interested in being watched. Dorson found me near the second hour of the ball, when the kitchen had settled into the quieter work of keeping dishes warm and sending platters up through the service stair. He was a small, round-shouldered man, old enough that the wolf in him had gone quiet on its own, and he moved through the kitchen with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that everything happening around him was probably fine. He set a cup of broth beside my station without comment and stood next to me for a moment, watching the fire. "They'll be doing the walkthrough soon," he said. "The king's men go room to room. It's protocol. Every she-wolf in the keep is to be presented to the mates' hall for at least a moment of proximity." He paused. "Technically, that means all of us, all residents." I looked at him. "Marin told me to stay here." "Marin tells you a great many things." He picked up his cup and drank from it. "The protocol is the king's, not Marin's. His men read it out this morning. Every resident she-wolf of age within the walls of Blackthorn Keep." I felt something shift in my chest. Not the wolf, something more specifically human. A cold, clarifying awareness. Dorson. "I'm just telling you what I heard," he said, and walked away. I stood for a long moment with my hands on the edge of the work table, the wood worn smooth under my palms from years of exactly this standing at this table, hands pressed to this surface, making myself be sensible. The fire crackled. The music filtered down through the floors. My wolf pushed against me, and for once I did not push back. The walkthrough happened at the third hour, and I was still in the kitchen when it did. 2 of the king's men came through the service entrance, which surprised me. I had expected them to simply pass by, and they were not unkind, but they were thorough. They moved through the kitchen space with their lists, noting every woman present, and when they came to me, the older one looked at his parchment and then at me and said, "Name?" "Senna," I said. "No surname. Domestic ward, Lady Marin's household." He wrote it down. He did not seem troubled by it one way or another. "Age and status?" 22, unmated, unaffiliated. He wrote that too, and then they moved on, and I thought that was the end of it. I thought the list would go upstairs and be processed, and nothing further would happen, and I would finish my shift and go to bed and wake up tomorrow and everything would be exactly as it had been. I was still thinking that when the third man came, he was not one of the king's household guard. He was the king's chancellor. I recognized him from the autumn visit 3 years ago. A tall, spare man with iron gray hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend their lives managing powerful things. His name was Aldrich, and he stood in the entrance to the kitchen and looked at me with an expression I could not read. And then he said, very precisely, "The Alpha King requests the presence of the woman identified as Senna, ward of Blackthorn, in the mates' hall, immediately." The kitchen went quiet, not gradually, immediately. Every person in the room became very still, and in the stillness I could feel the weight of their looking. The scullery women, the kitchen boys, old Dorson in the corner, 2 of Lady Marin's personal maids who had come down for a late platter and were now standing with the platter between them and their mouths slightly open. I said, "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake," the Chancellor said. "Please come now." I was wearing a kitchen dress, a heavy, serviceable thing in dark brown wool with a linen apron over the top of it. My hair was in a work braid that had been coming loose for an hour. I smelled of smoke and rendered fat and the particular animal warmth of a long shift in front of open fires. I was, in every visible way, the most wrong person to walk into a mating hall full of silk-gowned, high-born she-wolves, and I was aware of this with a crystalline, almost peaceful clarity as I untied my apron and set it on the work table and followed the chancellor up the service stairs. I told myself there had been an administrative error, some confusion in the records. He would correct it when he saw me in the light, or someone else would correct it, and I would be sent back. That was the most likely outcome. I repeated it to myself on every step of the stair, like a small, sensible prayer. My wolf did not believe a word of it. The mates' hall was not what I had pictured. I had imagined something ornate Blackthorn's great hall dressed for ceremony, and in some ways it was that. The candles and the gowns, and the particular brightness of a room full of people performing their best selves. But the hall itself had been cleared to its essential proportions. The long tables pushed back, and what remained was a wide open floor where the she-wolves had been arranged in a loose, slow-moving assembly, and at the far end of the room, apart from the assembly and flanked by two of his men, stood Caelum Drest. I stopped walking. I could not help it. My legs simply required a moment. He was exactly as I remembered from that single autumn glimpse, and nothing like it, because then I had seen only his back and his profile through crowds and distance, and now he was full facing the room with the kind of presence that did not need height or volume to fill every inch of available space. He was not beautiful in the easy way of men designed to be looked at. He was something harder than that angular jaw, a long, undecorated face, dark hair that had not been styled so much as simply pushed back with an impatient hand. He wore the deep gray of his house with no ornamentation except the small, bone-white device at his collar. That was the Alpha King's mark. His eyes were moving slowly across the room with the methodical attention of someone doing necessary work, and his expression was exactly as every story described it entirely, exhaustingly closed. The Chancellor moved me forward. I went because the alternative was to turn and run back down the stairs, and some part of me understood that I had passed the moment where that was a real option. I was near the back edge of the assembly when it happened. I know the moment precisely because my wolf went from restless to absolute in half a breath, from pacing to pinned, completely still, the way prey animals go still. And I know what the other half of that breath brought, because I watched it happen. Across the length of the hall, Caelum Drest stopped moving. His gaze found me the way a needle finds north. Not searching, not gradual. The way something orients that has found what it was already looking for. The hall did not go quiet, not all at once, but it began to rippling outward from us like something dropped into still water. The conversations dropping away one by one as people noticed what they were looking at, which was the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, standing perfectly motionless, staring at the woman in the kitchen dress at the back of the room. I could not breathe. My wolf was so still inside me that I could feel my own heartbeat from the outside, as if it were happening to someone else. He crossed the room. He did not look at anyone else. He did not acknowledge the Chancellor who moved to intercept him, or the two she-wolves who turned toward him with the practiced grace of women who had been preparing for exactly this moment, or the low sound of whispered speculation that began to rise from every corner as he walked past all of them. He walked in a straight line, the way men walk who are not in the habit of being redirected, and he stopped in front of me. This close, his scent was I had no useful language for it. 3 years ago, it had stopped me cold in an open courtyard. Here in a closed room, it was like something structural, like the first note of a piece of music that contains every subsequent note inside it. My wolf made a sound in my chest that was not audible to anyone else but felt seismic to me. He said nothing for a long moment. He looked at me with those closed, careful eyes, and I could see the moment I could see it move across him, when certainty became undeniable. His jaw tightened. Something in the region of his throat moved. He looked like a man who had been handed the answer to a question he had been dreading for years, and found, in the moment of receiving it, that the answer was not what he expected, but was nonetheless absolutely, irrevocably correct. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was lower than I had expected, controlled, the way everything about him seemed controlled, but with an understratum of something that was not controlled at all. "Senna," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I deserved. I'm from the kitchen. I think there may have been—" "There was no mistake," he said. The words landed in the room like something physical. I heard the exact sound of the assembly taking that in, not quite a gasp, something smaller and more electric. I heard, too, the specific quality of Lady Marin's silence from somewhere behind me to my left, the kind of silence that has edges. "You don't know me," I said, because someone had to say something true. "I'm nobody. I'm a ward. I have no pack, no family. No, I'm in a kitchen dress. I'm not." "I know what you are," he said. And then, quieter, in a register that was probably not meant to carry, but carried anyway in a room, gone nearly silent. "You are mine." I should say, here, what happened inside me in that moment, because the outside of me was doing a reasonable impression of a person who was managing the situation. Inside me, there was nothing reasonable happening at all. My wolf had broken her stillness and was doing something that could only be described as howling, not in distress, not in grief, the opposite of those things, and I felt it from my sternum to the soles of my feet. This deep seismic yes that I had been sitting on for 3 years in a kitchen. This thing I had told myself was not mine to feel and therefore did not feel, and it was enormous. It was the size of the room. It was bigger than the room. And it was followed immediately by the most clarifying, most concrete fear of my adult life. Because Lady Marin was crossing the floor toward us, and her face told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. She was a handsome woman, Lady Marin, the kind of handsome that is maintained by discipline and self-awareness and the knowledge that one's position in the world depends partly on appearance. She was the highest-ranking holder in the Blackthorn territory, connected to 3 of the 4 northern pack lines by blood or marriage, and she had spent the last several months engineering this mating ball with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood exactly what a royal mate bond would mean for the family who produced it. She had a niece here tonight, Vessa, 24, red-haired and trained and lovely, and she had 2 cousins of other families whom she had personally invited and coached. She had not invited me. She had put me in the kitchen. She stopped at a respectful distance from the king and executed a precise inclination of the head. "My Lord Alpha," she said, "I must apologize for this disruption." The girl Senna, she should not have been brought up from the kitchens. There was a clerical error in the walkthrough. She is a domestic ward, unaffiliated. She has no... "She was on the list," the Chancellor said from somewhere behind the king. "The list was in error," Marin said. Her voice was silk over stone. "This is not the appropriate venue for a ward of her classification. I will have someone escort her back to..." "No," the king said. A single word. It did not require volume. The room heard it the way rooms hear irreversible things. Marin's expression did not change, but her eyes did something moved through them that was colder than her usual composure. "My lord, I understand that the girl is that proximity in a room like this can create certain impressions, but surely a more appropriate..." "Lady Marin," the king said, still looking at me, "I am going to ask you to step back." She stepped back. She had no other choice, and she knew it. But I felt the force of her gaze as she retreated, and it was not something I could dismiss. I had lived inside that gaze my entire life. I knew every texture of it. The mild irritation when I was useful, the brisk indifference when I was not, and now, in this moment, something I had not encountered before, a cold, focused displeasure that told me she was not finished, that whatever happened in this hall tonight, there would be a conversation afterward that I was not going to enjoy. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was what she had already arranged. The rest of that night was it moved strangely. The Alpha King did not leave my side, which created a particular kind of pressure in the room, a reorganization of its emotional weather, the way weather changes when a storm front moves in. The high-born she-wolves were too well-bred to make a scene, but the scene was there beneath the surfaces in the way Vessa, Marin's niece, held her wineglass a fraction too tightly, in the way conversations stopped and restarted with the slightly breathless quality of people processing something they had not prepared for, in the way certain women moved toward the exits with the controlled grace of those who have decided to cut their losses. The King Caelum, and I was not yet able to think of him by his given name, without something in me flinching, stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of him even through the noise and candlelight and crowd. He spoke to me, not at me, not around me, to me, with a directness that was slightly overwhelming in a person of such evident importance. He asked me ordinary things: how long I had been at Blackthorn, what my work involved, whether I had been born in the territory or come to it later. He listened to my answers with an attention that was disarming. He gave nothing away in his expression, maintained the same controlled exterior he had walked in with, but his attention was complete, and I found myself saying more than I intended, drawn out by the quality of his listening, the way you are drawn out by someone who actually wants to know. I told him about my mother, who had died when I was 5, and the road she had died on, and how I had come to Blackthorn as a child with nothing but a name and the clothes I was wearing. I told him about the kitchens, the work, the years of it, told him the practical shape of my life without apology or performance, because I was too overwhelmed to have the energy for either. He took it all in without comment, without the polite, slightly pained expression people sometimes wore when I talked about the more basic elements of my circumstances. Then he said, "You knew, before tonight." I went still. He was watching me with something that was almost careful. Not careful like someone concealing something, careful like someone handling something that matters. I thought about lying. I thought about the several available versions of strategic truth that would let me avoid the direct answer. Then I thought about the 3 years I had spent in a kitchen with the door closed on myself, and something in me was simply too tired for any more of that. "Yes," I said, 3 years ago, you passed through on progress." "I did not see you," he said. It wasn't an apology or an accusation. It was a statement of something that clearly troubled him. "I know, I made sure of it." He was quiet for a moment. The music had changed to something slower. Around us, the assembly had thinned. Several families had made gracious exits, and the ones who remained were doing the careful, deliberate social work of pretending they were not watching us. "Why?" he asked. I looked at him and I said what was true. Because I knew what I was, and I knew what you were, and I could not imagine a version of it that made sense, so I didn't. I chose not to imagine it. He looked at me for a long time. Whatever he was thinking did not surface cleanly, but underneath his controlled expression there was something, a quality of recognition, maybe, or of grief. "I have been doing the same thing," he said, quietly, "for considerably longer than 3 years. For different reasons." I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to ask very much. But before I could, the Chancellor appeared at the King's shoulder with the particular quality of urgency that subordinates develop when something requires interruption. And the King was drawn away into a brief, low conversation, and I stood for a moment in the warm noise of the thinning hall and tried to understand what my life was doing. What my life was doing, as it turned out, was about to become significantly more complicated. The morning after the mating ball, Lady Marin called me to her private sitting room before breakfast, which had never happened in the years I had lived under her roof. The sitting room was pale and ordered and smelled of dried flowers and the particular expensive soap she used, and she stood in the center of it when I entered with the composed authority of a woman who has spent the night making decisions. She told me, without preamble, that the King had made an inquiry about my status, about the formal record of my ward classification, and what it would require to transfer my residency. She told me that this inquiry was well-intentioned but based on a misunderstanding, and that she had explained to the Chancellor that there were existing legal arrangements regarding my situation that made such a transfer complicated. She told me that these arrangements were for my own protection, and that I would understand that better when I was older, which was how she had always framed the things she didn't want me to know about. Then she said something that she framed as information, but that landed as instruction, that whatever had occurred at the ball, whatever impressions had been formed, it would be best for everyone, for the stability of the territory, for the smooth function of the keep, and especially for me if I did not encourage further contact. That the King's obligations were larger than any single knight's impression, that the northern packs needed a mate of standing and connection, and that I was, in all measurable ways, the wrong person for that role. "I'm not doing this to be unkind," she said. "I want you to understand that. I am trying to manage something delicate for the good of this house." "I understand," I said, because I always said that, because it was the easiest thing to say and it let me leave the room. What I understood, walking back to the kitchens, was that I did not fully understand at all. There was something in the phrase existing legal arrangements that snagged at me, that had a weight and specificity that Marin's other justifications did not. She was not a careless woman. She did not choose her words carelessly. Existing legal arrangements meant documents. Documents meant something had been written down. And something written down about me, something that Marin had used to complicate the king's inquiry, was something I had not known about. I went to Dorson. He was in the herb room when I found him, sitting on his low stool with a clay pot between his knees and the look of a man who had been waiting for someone to arrive. I sat on the floor across from him, the way I had sat as a child when the herb room was the only quiet place in the keep, and I said, "What do you know about my legal status here?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I knew the answer was not simple. "Your mother," he said finally. "She was not without kin. She had a mate, a bonded mate, before she died, a man from one of the mountain packs, far eastern territory. He did not come for you when she died, because he paused. There were reasons he could not. He was not well. He died within the year. He turned the clay pot slowly in his hands. But they had a bond record. A proper one, filed with the territory keeper, which means you have a pack of origin, Senna, which means you are not an unaffiliated ward, which means the paperwork that Marin filed when she took you in classified you incorrectly, deliberately incorrectly. I sat with that for a moment, the weight of it. She took me in, I said. She cared for me. She did, Dorson said, and she also registered you in a way that gave her permanent guardianship control and removed your ability to transfer residency without her sign-off. I found the documents 8 years ago by accident. I have regretted not telling you ever since. He looked up at me, his old eyes very direct. I thought I was protecting you from information that would only cause pain. I understand now that I was wrong. She had taken me in, and she had also caged me. Not cruelly, not with malice, or not only with malice I didn't know anymore. She had fed me and housed me and given me work, and in the same motion had ensured I could never leave without her permission, never escalate my status without her cooperation, never become anything that might require her to reconsider the arrangement. And now the king had made an inquiry, and she had used those documents to slow it, to complicate it, to introduce doubt. And somewhere in Blackthorn Keep, Caelum Drest was receiving information about me that had been filtered through a woman who had a quiet, determined interest in making sure I stayed exactly where I was. I could feel my wolf, very steady now, not frantic, not pacing, watching. I thought about going back to work. The thought was almost habitual when uncertain, return to the task at hand. I had been doing that for 22 years, and it had served me, after a fashion. It had kept me safe and employed and fed and entirely unable to claim anything that was actually mine. I thought about the king's face when he said, "You are mine," not possessive, not commanding, or not only those things. Something underneath the authority, something that had looked, for one unguarded moment, like relief. I thought about 3 years in a kitchen with the door closed on something that mattered. I went to find the chancellor. It took 2 hours. He was not easy to locate. The keep was in the organized chaos of post-ball activity, servants and household staff, and visiting retinues all in motion at once. And when I found him, he was in the outer courtyard with 2 of his men, preparing what appeared to be a departure. My chest clenched. I walked faster. "Chancellor Aldrich," I said, "I need to speak with you before you leave." He turned and looked at me with the same unreadable expression he had worn in the kitchen the night before. "Lady Marin has already." "I know what Lady Marin told you," I said. "I want to tell you what she didn't. I had not planned this speech. I was not a person who made speeches, but I had the information Dorson had given me, and I had the certainty of my wolf, and I had 22 years of being very tired of staying quiet, and it turned out that was enough to go on. My mother had a bond record, a legitimate pack affiliation through her mate, my father. That record should be on file with the Eastern Territory Keeper. It predates Marin's guardianship claim by at least a year. If that record exists and can be verified, her control over my residency transfer is not legally sound." The chancellor looked at me for a long moment. You have documentation of this bond record? Not in my hands. I have a source who saw it. I can give you the territory, the approximate date, the pack designation. I held his gaze. I am asking you to verify it before you go. I am asking you not to accept Lady Marin's account without checking the underlying records. Another long pause. Around us, the courtyard activity continued: horses, baggage, the orderly noise of a retinue preparing to move. Then he said, "Wait here," and went back inside. I waited. I stood in the courtyard with the late morning cold coming off the mountain, and the smell of horse and frost and the distant ghost trace of last night's candles still in my hair, and I waited. My wolf was very quiet. I was very quiet. We both understood that this was the moment where it went one way or the other, and neither of us had anything useful left to do but stand still and let it happen. The Chancellor was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, he was not alone. Caelum Drest walked out of the keep behind his Chancellor into the thin mountain light, and he looked at me where I stood in the courtyard, and something in the set of his face had changed from last night. Last night there had been the shock of recognition, the careful control over something enormous. This morning, standing in the ordinary gray light without candles and silk around him, he looked like a man who had been awake for most of the night and had arrived at a position he intended to hold. He stopped in front of me. "She has been filing incorrect residency classifications for 22 years, he said. There was a careful flatness in his voice that I had not heard before, the specific flatness of anger that is being managed rather than expressed. "I only learned this morning," I said. "I know. Aldrich told me what you brought to him and how you brought it." He paused. "You could have stayed in the kitchen. You could have done nothing and let Marin's account stand." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I looked at him in the morning light, this man I had been carefully not knowing for 3 years. This man who had crossed a hall full of better options to stand in front of a woman in a kitchen dress and say the truest thing he knew. I thought about the room I had kept closed in myself for so long, the careful maintenance of it, the daily discipline of not wanting what I wanted. I thought about Dorson's face when he said, "I have regretted not telling you ever since." "Because I am very tired," I said, "of managing things that should not need managing." Something in his expression shifted. Not a smile. His face was not a face that moved easily to smiling. But something opened in it, some small, precise degree of warmth. And it was the most undefended thing I had seen on a person's face in years. He said, "I need you to come with me, not the Keep the Mountain Lodge, which is Alpha King's ground and not Lady Marin's jurisdiction. There are legal steps that need to happen before anything else, and I want them to happen somewhere she cannot interfere." "She will object," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "I am not particularly concerned about that." I had almost nothing to bring. A small bundled change of clothes, the carved wooden token Dorson had given me when I was 10 years old, and which I had kept every year since, and the herb keeper himself standing in the kitchen doorway watching me go with an expression that was grief and relief in equal measure. I put my hand briefly on his shoulder as I passed, and he patted it once, firmly. And then I walked out of Blackthorn Keep and into the late morning cold, and did not look back until we had cleared the outer gates. When I did look back, the keep was just stone and windows against the pale mountain sky, and from the upper window of the sitting room where she had spoken to me that morning, Lady Marin was watching me go. The mountain lodge was 2 hours' ride, and the king rode beside me for most of it. He was not a conversational rider. He was a man who seemed comfortable with silence, more comfortable with it than most people are. And I had grown up in the particular silence of keeping rooms where conversation was not encouraged, so we made the ride mostly quiet and it was not uncomfortable. At some point, in the second hour, when the tree line had thickened around us and the sound of the wind through the pines had replaced the sound of the valley, he said, without looking at me, "I want to tell you something." "All right," I said. I have been aware, for some years, that I was going to recognize my mate in an unexpected place. He seemed to be choosing his words with the particular care of someone who rarely explains himself. There where my mother was a seer. Not fully, not reliably, but she had moments. She told me, before she died, that my mate would come from the ground up. That was how she put it. I did not understand it then. I spent a long time trying to understand it in ways that still made sense to me, that still kept me inside my expectations. A pause. I should have understood sooner. I thought about that. Would it have changed anything if you had understood sooner? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, I would have looked for you sooner, in the kitchens and the service stairs and the working rooms, all the places where I don't normally look. Another pause, and then something that was not quite wry, but had the shadow of it, though I imagine you would have hidden from me. Probably, I admitted. Why? Not accusatory, genuinely wanting to know. I thought about how to say the thing I had never said. When you have spent a long time being exactly what other people classify you as, I said slowly, it becomes very difficult to believe in a classification that they have not provided. I was a ward, a domestic, an unaffiliated. Those were the words, the official words. And when the Alpha King's scent hit me in a courtyard 3 years ago, there were no official words for that. There was just me, feeling something I had not been assigned permission to feel. I stopped, started again. It was easier to put it away. Yes, he said, just that. But he said it with an understanding that did not feel polite or performative, that felt like someone who knew the interior of that particular choice from the inside. And I realized for the first time, actually realized, with a clarity that made my chest ache, that whatever he had said about trying to understand his mother's prophecy in ways that still kept him inside his expectations, he had been doing his own version of this, waiting out a recognition he could not fully allow himself to expect, managing something that should not have needed managing. We were not so different in that, the king and I. We had both been in our own kitchens. The lodge was warmer than I expected, both physically and in its proportions, not a grand formal space, but a working lodge, used for hunting season and border visits, with a large fire and simple furniture, and the smell of old wood and pine resin that I found immediately steadying. The king's small retinue, 6 men, and the chancellor arranged themselves with efficient discretion, and then Caelum led me to the main room and indicated a chair by the fire and sat across from me. The legal work will take days, he said. Aldrich will send riders to the Eastern Territory Keeper tonight. If your mother's bond record is on file, we can have the documentation within 4 days. That will nullify Marin's guardianship claim and clear the way for whatever comes next. And if the record isn't there? I asked. Then we use a different mechanism, he said simply. There are several. The Alpha King's claim supersedes most guardianship arrangements under Northern Pack law, particularly in matters of mate bonds. It would take longer and require council involvement, but the outcome would be the same. He looked at me steadily. I want you to understand that the outcome is not in question. What Marin has done is, at minimum, administrative fraud. At maximum, it is a violation of your pack rights. Either way, the bond is mine to claim and yours to choose, and I intend to make sure you have the legal footing to make that choice freely. I had not expected him to be so direct. I had prepared myself, riding up the mountain, for more complexity for the political realities, the council pressure, the succession requirements that had driven the mating ball in the first place. I had prepared for a careful conversation about feasibility and difficulty and the many reasons why this situation was complicated. You keep saying that, I said, that it's mine to choose, but you also came across a room full of better options, and you haven't asked what I know what you want, he said. I can feel it, as you can feel what I want. He held my gaze. But I will not pretend that knowing is the same as choosing. The bond does not require your choice. That is what makes the choice matter. I sat with that. Across from me, in the firelight, he looked less like the Alpha King of the Northern Packs, and more like a man. A man who had slept badly and ridden 2 hours in the cold, and was now sitting in a hunting lodge, explaining himself to a woman in a kitchen dress with the careful earnestness of someone who had perhaps never done this before, and was not certain he was doing it correctly. Yes, I said, to be clear, yes. Something in him settled, not dramatically. He was not a dramatic person, but like a structure that has been braced for a load setting down evenly, finding its actual weight. He let out a breath that was very controlled, but was still, unmistakably, relief. Good, he said. And then, I need to tell you about the coldness, the things people say about me, about my manner. I want you to know the reason before the council and the gossip and everything else gets to it first. He looked at the fire rather than at me, and in the side-lit shadows he looked younger than his years, or perhaps truer to them. My first chancellor died in the Ashvale War. He was my father's man, and mine, and I was with him when it happened, and afterward I concluded that distance was a form of competence, that a king who does not attach does not create vulnerabilities. It seemed rational at the time. A pause. It was not, particularly, but it became habitual. And habits that involve not feeling are very easy to maintain because they provide the illusion of control. He was looking at me now. I am telling you this because you will find me difficult to read, at times. I am telling you this so that you can attribute the difficulty correctly. I thought about the door I had kept closed in myself for 3 years, about the daily practice of not wanting, about how thoroughly I had convinced myself that the practical shape of my life, the work, the walls, the kitchen, was enough, was good, was the appropriate scope of things. We were both, I thought, very fluent in the language of managed distance. We had both, in our different circumstances, developed the same survival skill. I know that language, I said. I speak it too. He looked at me for a moment, and then, very slowly, in a way that rearranged his entire face, Caelum Drest smiled. It was not a large smile. It was, in fact, quite small. But it was genuine in the way that things are genuine when they are rare, when they have not been worn smooth by repetition, when they cost something to produce. And it hit me somewhere behind the sternum with the specific force of things that are real, and my wolf, who had been so patient all day, made that sound again, the seismic yes. The 4 days of waiting were not easy, but they were not what I had feared. There was no removal back to the keep, no isolation while the legal work progressed. The Chancellor communicated with Blackthorn through formal channels, and Lady Marin's responses, channeled back through the same formality, were carefully worded and very cold, and entirely unable to reverse what was already in motion. Vessa, her red-haired niece, sent a private note that surprised me. It said only that she was not her aunt, and that she wished me well, and that she had always thought the ward in the kitchen had a quiet quality she admired. I read it twice and decided it was sincere. The riders returned on the 4th morning, and the bond record was there. My mother and father, properly documented, the pack seal intact, filed with the Eastern Keeper 6 years before my mother died. My legal status, as of that document's application, was not unaffiliated ward, but pack daughter of the Crest Mountain line, with all the rights and standing that entailed. Marin had known. She had known when she filed her claim, and she had known every year since, and she had managed it, quietly and efficiently, the way she managed everything. I sat with the document in my hands for a long time, reading my parents' names at the top of it. My father's name. I had never known his name. It was Ruvan, and he had been bonded to my mother for 3 years before she died, and somewhere in the Eastern Territories there was a pack that had produced him and therefore, in some small ancestral way, produced me. I had not been unaffiliated. I had not been nobody. I had been misclassified for 22 years by a woman who needed me to stay where I was. The claiming ceremony happened on the 6th day, in the lodge, with only the Chancellor and 2 witnesses and the old words that had been used for this in the northern packs since before anyone had thought to write them down. It was not the grand formal binding that a council-approved royal mate claiming would eventually require. That ceremony was coming, with all its political weight and public necessity, in the weeks ahead. This was something smaller and therefore in some ways more substantial. Just the 2 of us and the fire and the words and the moment where the bond, which had existed in potential for 3 years, was finally, consciously, on both sides, made real. I will not describe what happens when a mate bond completes between 2 people who have been waiting for it as long as we had. 2 people who have spent years managing the door that this moment opens. There is no language adequate to it that doesn't tip into purple exaggeration or clinical detachment. What I will say is that it was warm, and that it was vast, and that every careful, practiced piece of distance I had ever built fell away so completely that I could not, in the moment afterward, remember quite what they had been protecting me from. What I will say is that his hands, when he held mine, were warm, and that he said my name the way you say something you have been waiting to say for a long time, like setting something down that has been heavy. What I will say is that I understood, in that moment, what my mother's bond record had been telling me all along, that I came from this, from people who chose each other fully, that it was not a foreign thing, not an impossible thing, not a thing that belonged to other people in other lives, that it was, in fact, the most fundamental inheritance I had, the thing that had survived every misclassification and closed door and kitchen I had ever been put in. The council convening took 3 weeks to arrange, and in those 3 weeks the story moved through the north, the way stories move through tight-connected pack territories fast, and with significant embellishment. There were versions in which I had crashed the mating ball intentionally. There were versions in which the king had rejected dozens of high-born she-wolves in succession until he reached me. There were versions in which Marin had imprisoned me in the kitchens under lock and key, which was more dramatic than accurate, though the legal effect had not been so different. The true version was stranger and simpler. A man and a woman had recognized each other across a hall, and one of them had been standing in a kitchen dress, and the other had walked past every available convenience to get to her, and that had been enough to begin with. The council was a different matter. 13 members, representing the 4 northern pack lines, meeting in the Ashvale Hall, which was the neutral formal ground for such things, and they had collectively spent the past 3 weeks absorbing the information that their alpha king had found his mate in the unaffiliated domestic ward of a regional keep. Some of them had made peace with this. Others were in the process of making peace with it. A few had not yet arrived at anything resembling peace and were managing with the stiff cordiality of people who are very aware of where the power sits. Marin was there. She was required to be. She was one of the 13. By virtue of Blackthorn's regional standing, and she sat in her council seat with the perfect composure of a woman who has processed her losses in private and arrived in public with everything arranged. She had not contested the bond record finding. She had not formally challenged the king's claim. She had, instead, taken the position of a person who accepts the situation gracefully, which was in many ways more unsettling than open opposition would have been. I came into the hall beside the king, and I wore a dress that had been made for me in the 3 weeks at the lodge, a proper dress in the gray-blue of dressed colors. Not elaborate, but correct, because someone on the king's staff had quietly ensured that I would not walk into the council in kitchen wool. I was aware of every eye in the room, and I was aware of Marin's in particular, and I kept my shoulders level and my chin at the angle that women who have worked hard all their lives learn to use when they are entering a room that would prefer them to look smaller than they are. The king spoke first, as was his right and role, laying out the bond claim and the legal grounds and the finding of the bond record in the formal language that these occasions required. Then the council had their period of question and response. Most of it was procedural. Some of it was pointed. One of the older members, a woman from the Western Line who had been quietly hostile to the idea since news broke, asked directly whether it was the king's position that a woman with no active pack affiliation, no political connections, and no demonstrated understanding of Northern Pack governance was the appropriate mate for the Alpha King. The room held its breath. Caelum looked at the member with the patient, level attention of a man who has heard this argument in various forms in his own head and has already answered it. "It is my position," he said, "that my mate is the daughter of a bonded pair from the Crest Mountain Line, which is one of the oldest continuous pack lines in the Eastern Territory. That she has been incorrectly classified for 22 years due to deliberate falsification is an administrative injustice, not a reflection of her standing. And it is my position that whatever standing she came in with or did not come in with, she leaves this hall as the Alpha King's bonded mate and the future Alpha Queen of the Northern Packs, and that any further questions about her fitness are questions about mine, and I am willing to discuss those if anyone wants to continue." The older member did not want to continue. Marin raised her hand. Silence fell in the particular way it falls when something has been anticipated and not quite dreaded, and I felt the attention of the room shift to her as she rose from her seat with the composed authority of long practice. "I wish to make a formal statement," she said, and her voice was exactly as it always was, clear, measured, without warmth or cruelty. "What I did in filing the incorrect classification and maintaining it for 22 years, was done in the context of a household decision I believed to be in the ward's best interest. I understand now that it was not. I understand that the result was a limitation on freedoms she was legally entitled to. She looked at me, directly, for the first time since the ball. I want to say in this hall that the limitation was real and its effects were real, and that my intentions do not constitute an excuse for the outcome. A pause. I am prepared to accept whatever formal finding the council makes regarding the classification record. It was not an apology. It was something more complex and, in some ways, more honest than an apology, a statement of fact by a woman who understood exactly what she had done and was choosing to put it on the record correctly rather than defend it past the point of utility. I did not know what to do with it, quite. I had spent a week being very angry about Marin, a clean and clarifying anger that had helped me get through the legal proceedings and the council preparation and the long conversations about my parents' names on a bond record, and now she was standing in a formal hall admitting to the thing I was angry about. And the anger was doing something complicated in my chest that was not yet forgiveness, but was at least the beginning of understanding that forgiveness might, eventually, be possible. The formal finding was clear. The bond record was entered into the official Northern Pack registry under my correct name and lineage. Lady Marin's guardianship filing was struck. The incorrect classification was formally noted as a violation of pack law. And Caelum Drest's mate bond claim was ratified by the council in a vote that was not unanimous, but was sufficient, 11-2, and the two who voted against were noted and did not make further issue of it. Then the council session was over, and the formal hall began to decompress in the ways formal halls do, the careful redistribution of people toward doors and smaller conversations, and the king came to stand beside me and said, quietly, "Are you all right?" I thought about the question. I thought about what all right meant, whether I was the same person who had gone to sleep in the scullery room 3 weeks ago, whether the kitchen dress was still me in some way that the gray-blue dress was not yet, whether the names Senna, bondmaid of Drest, Alpha Queen-elect of the Northern Packs, fit the same body that had turned spit handles and carried herb crates and pressed her palms against a worn work table and told herself that this was enough. I thought about my parents' names on a document that had been real all along. "Yes," I said. "Then ask me again in a month." He made the sound that, I had learned in 3 weeks of proximity, was what his laugh sounded like: low, brief, genuine, the way everything about him was genuine beneath the layers of management. "I will ask you every day," he said. He would. That was the thing about Caelum Drest, that no story told correctly. The stories got the coldness right. The authority, the unreadable exterior, the controlled efficiency that had carried him through a war and a drought, and 13 difficult council members. What the stories missed was that underneath all of that, in the private register that I was beginning to know the way you know a room you live in, he was someone who noticed things, who paid attention with his whole self when he decided something mattered, who had spent years distributing distance because he had learned that attachment creates vulnerability, and who was now, day by day, in the way that careful people do it, learning that there was a different way to understand the same truth, that the right attachment does not create vulnerability, it creates ground. Marin found me in the outer corridor as the hall emptied. She did not approach with her usual authority. She approached with something that was not quite uncertainty, but was the texture of a woman who has prepared for this and is still not certain of her footing. She stopped at a conversational distance. "What I said in there," she said, "I want you to know it was not performance." "I know," I said. I did know. Marin was many things, but she was not, in the end, a person who performed sincerity she did not have. I told myself, for a long time, that keeping you manageable was a form of protection, she said. That if you didn't reach for things outside the household, you couldn't be hurt by failing to get them. It was convenient reasoning. It also happened to serve my interests. She looked at me steadily. "I don't ask you to forgive it." "I know you don't," I said. "Give me time." She nodded once, and that was as much as either of us could do in a corridor outside a council hall, and she moved away, and I stood for a moment in the stone quiet of the passage and breathed. My wolf was settled. She had been settled. this great patient creature inside me who had spent years being inconvenient since the night of the claiming. She had found what she needed and she had curled around it, and she was, for the first time in my memory, simply at rest. The king's public declaration was made at the midwinter gathering of the Northern Pax, the Solstice Assembly that had been, in its original form, the political deadline for his bond claiming. It was not now what it had been designed to be. It was larger and louder, and weighted differently, not the anxious assembly of factions waiting to see which high-born family would gain royal advantage, but something more than that. He stood in the assembly hall with me beside him and the gathered Pax before him, and he did not, in the end, make a formal speech. He said what was true, in the plain way he always said what was true when he chose to say it. He said that his mate had been in Blackthorn Keep for 22 years, and that she had been placed where she was by circumstances that were neither just nor accidental, and that she had conducted herself through those circumstances with a quality of dignity and practical courage that he personally found instructive. He said that her lineage was documented and her bond with him was ratified, and her standing as Alpha Queen of the Northern Pax was no longer a matter for discussion. And then he said, and I heard it go through the hall in a wave, she spent 22 years being told she was nobody. She spent 3 of them knowing the truth and choosing silence because she did not believe she was allowed to say it. How could I not love every part of what that cost her? How could I not choose the woman who carried that weight and still came to find my chancellor in a courtyard and told him what was true? I was looking at him when he said it. Afterward, he looked at me, and I thought about the first morning in the courtyard and standing still and waiting for it to go one way or the other, and the document with my parents' names, and the small, genuine smile in the lodge firelight, and the warm groundedness of him beside me through 3 weeks of legal complexity and political navigation. I thought about the kitchen and the closed door and the careful maintenance of not wanting. I thought about how extraordinary it was, how genuinely, impossibly extraordinary, that the thing I had spent years hiding from had turned out to be exactly the thing that was mine. The midwinter snow began that night, and by morning it had covered the peaks and the valleys of the Northern Territory in white, and Senna of the Crest Mountain line bonded mate of the Alpha King, future queen of the Northern Pax, former keeper of a kitchen fire in a keep where she had been told every quiet day for years that tonight was not a night for her, woke in the lodge bedroom to the sound of it and lay still for a moment listening, and felt all the way down to the floor of herself that she had at last come home.